The car had been parked across the street for 11 minutes without moving, and Daniel Hart noticed it the way he noticed everything on this street after midnight, because paying attention was the only thing that kept a delivery driver safe on a night shift. He was locking up his bike outside the corner store when he saw her. A young woman in a green jacket stumbled out of the bar 2 doors down, one hand pressed against the wall, her legs unsure of where the ground was. She was alone, and the men inside that parked car were watching her the way a fox watches a bird that has fallen from its nest. Daniel told himself it was none of his business. He told himself that twice, actually, and both times his feet stayed exactly where they were, refusing to walk away. The woman took 3 steps and nearly went down onto the pavement. She caught herself on a trash can, laughed at nothing, then looked around with the confused, glassy expression of someone who had no idea which direction home was in. The driver's door of the parked car opened. A man stepped out, tall, wearing a jacket too heavy for the weather, and he crossed the street toward her with the kind of walk that was trying very hard to look casual, and failing. Daniel felt something tighten in his chest, an old instinct that had nothing to do with thinking and everything to do with survival. He moved before he decided to move. "Claire," he said loudly, guessing at nothing, just throwing out a name to make it look like he knew her. "Hey, Claire, there you are." The woman blinked at him, swaying. Up close she looked younger than he'd first thought, maybe 24, with dark hair falling out of a ponytail, and mascara smudged under one eye. She squinted, trying to place his face, and for a terrible second, Daniel thought she would say she had never seen him before in her life. "I told you I'd come," he said gently, stepping between her and the approaching stranger. "Let's get you home." The man in the heavy jacket stopped a few feet away, sizing Daniel up. He was broader than Daniel, and there was a stillness to him that suggested he was used to getting his way through size alone. "She's fine," the man said. "We got it handled." "She's got a ride," Daniel said, keeping his voice even, keeping his eyes on the man's hands instead of his face, because hands were what told you if trouble was coming. "Thanks anyway." For 3 long seconds, nobody moved. The street was empty, except for the buzz of a broken sign above the bar, and the distant hum of traffic a block over. Daniel felt his pulse in his ears. Then the woman, Claire, though he still didn't actually know her name, leaned into his side like she'd known him for years, murmuring something about being tired, and the small motion broke the tension just enough. The man in the jacket glanced back toward the parked car, toward whoever was still sitting inside it, and something unspoken passed between them. He took a step back. "Have it your way," the man said, and there was no warmth in it at all. He turned and walked back across the street, unhurried, the kind of unhurried that was its own kind of threat. Daniel didn't wait to see what happened next. He put an arm carefully around Claire's shoulders, more to steady her than anything else, and started walking her away from the bar, away from the car, toward the corner where the streetlights were brighter, and a person walking home would look completely ordinary. His heart was still hammering. "Who was that guy?" Claire mumbled, her words sliding together. "Do I know you?" "No," Daniel admitted. "I'm sorry, those men were watching you and it didn't look right. My name is Daniel. Do you have someone I can call? A friend? Family? Anyone?" She dug into her jacket pocket with clumsy fingers and produced a phone with a badly cracked screen. She tried 3 times to unlock it, and failed 3 times. Daniel took it gently, and she let him, which told him how far gone she really was. He tried her recent calls. A contact named Olivia rang and went to voicemail. He tried again. Nothing. Behind them, half a block back, the parked car's engine turned over. Daniel glanced over his shoulder without turning his whole body, a trick he'd learned from years of riding a bike through traffic and needing to know what was behind him without losing his balance. The car was pulling out of its spot, slow, deliberate, keeping pace with them rather than driving away. "We need to move a little faster," he said quietly to Claire, and steered her around the next corner, off the main street, toward the row of apartment buildings where he lived. It wasn't the safest choice, bringing a stranger into his own home, and some part of him knew that, but leaving her on a bench outside a locked bar with 2 men circling in a car felt like handing her to a fate he wasn't willing to be responsible for. "Where are we going?" Claire asked, not frightened, just foggy, the alcohol wrapping her thoughts in cotton. "Somewhere safe. Just for tonight. I promise I'm not going to hurt you." She looked up at him with unfocused eyes, studying his face for a long moment. And then, strangely, she smiled. "You have an honest face," she said. "My sister says I can always tell." Then her knees buckled slightly, and Daniel caught her before she hit the ground, one arm under hers, holding most of her weight now as they moved. Behind them, the car had turned onto the same side street. Its headlights washed over the pavement, over their shadows stretched long and thin, and then, just as quickly, the car slowed and stopped at the corner instead of following further. Daniel didn't know if that meant the men had given up, or if it meant something worse, that they already knew exactly where he lived and didn't need to follow anymore. He pushed the thought down and kept walking. Claire's building keys jingled uselessly in her jacket pocket, useless to him since he had no idea which building was hers, and asking her for an address right now would only get him mumbled nonsense. His apartment was 4 minutes away. Hers, wherever it was, might as well have been on the moon tonight. They reached his building's front door, and Daniel fumbled his own keys out with his free hand, while keeping Claire upright with the other. The lock stuck the way it always stuck in humid weather, and for a moment he was aware of every second they stood exposed under the porch light, visible from the street, visible to anyone who might still be watching. Then the door gave, and they were inside, and the door clicked shut behind them, and Daniel allowed himself one full breath. "Second floor," he said, more to himself than to her, and helped her up the narrow staircase one careful step at a time. She hummed something under her breath, some song he didn't recognize, entirely unaware of how close the night might have gone a very different direction. Daniel found that both a relief and a strange kind of sadness. She had no idea how dangerous the last 20 minutes had actually been. Inside his apartment, he settled her onto the couch, propped a cushion behind her head, and brought a glass of water and a small trash bin, setting the bin within easy reach in case her stomach turned. She murmured a thank you that dissolved into sleep before she finished the sentence. Daniel stood in his own living room for a moment, looking at a stranger asleep on his couch, and felt the full, delayed weight of what had just happened hit him all at once. His hands were shaking slightly. He hadn't noticed until now. He crossed to the window and looked down at the street. The car was gone, or it had moved somewhere he couldn't see it, which was, if anything, worse. He pulled the curtain most of the way shut, leaving only a thin gap to check through later, and turned the deadbolt on his front door, then checked it again. He thought about calling the police, and got as far as picking up his phone, his thumb hovering over the keypad. But what would he say? A car was parked on a street. A man got out and walked toward a woman. Nothing had actually happened. Nothing he could point to and say, "Here, this is the crime." And yet every instinct in his body was telling him the danger hadn't ended just because they'd made it indoors. He set the phone down on the counter, screen facing up, ready. Claire shifted on the couch, murmured something that might have been a name, and went still again. Daniel pulled a blanket from the closet and laid it over her without waking her, then sat down in the armchair across the room, telling himself he would just rest his eyes for a moment, that he would stay alert, that he would hear if anything moved outside. Outside, 2 floors down and half a block away, the same car had returned, its engine off now, its headlights dark, parked in a spot with a clear view of Daniel's front door. Inside it, 2 men waited without speaking, patient in the specific way of people being paid to be patient, watching the light in a second-floor window until, one by one, the lights went out. Daniel did not sleep, not really. He drifted in and out of a shallow, uneasy rest in the armchair, waking every so often at small sounds, a car door somewhere on the street, a floorboard settling, the refrigerator clicking on in the kitchen. Each time, he opened his eyes and checked the room. Claire was still there, still breathing evenly, one arm hanging off the edge of the couch, completely unaware of the quiet vigil being kept over her. He found himself studying her face in the low light, wondering who she was, wondering why 2 grown men in a car had looked at her like she was something to be collected rather than someone to be helped. Around 3 in the morning, he got up and checked the window again. The street below looked empty. No car, no shapes standing in doorways, nothing but a stray cat crossing under the streetlight and vanishing into the dark between 2 buildings. He told himself that was a good sign. He told himself the men had lost interest, or lost their nerve, or simply given up and gone home. He almost believed it. He returned to the armchair, pulled his own jacket over his shoulders like a blanket, and closed his eyes again, though sleep still refused to come easily. Somewhere in the building above him, footsteps crossed a floor and stopped. A pipe knocked somewhere in the walls. Ordinary sounds. The sounds of any old building settling into night, and yet every one of them pulled Daniel's eyes back open, his body tensed and ready, before his mind had even finished deciding there was nothing to be ready for. By the time the sky outside the window began to turn from black to a deep, tired gray, Daniel had given up on sleeping altogether. He sat in the growing light, watching the stranger on his couch breathe slowly in and out, and wondered what she would think when she woke up in an apartment she didn't recognize, next to a man she had never properly met, with no memory at all of the two men who had been watching her from across the street. He wondered if she would be frightened of him. He wondered if she would even believe what he told her. And somewhere underneath those questions sat a colder one that he could not quite push away. If the men in the car had wanted her badly enough to wait outside a bar for her, they were not going to simply disappear because one night had passed without incident. Claire woke with a jolt just after 8, her eyes snapping open to a ceiling she did not recognize, and for 3 or 4 seconds she lay completely still, letting her mind catch up to her surroundings. Unfamiliar couch, unfamiliar blanket, a window with light coming through curtains that were not hers. Her heart began to pound before her brain had even finished the sentence, and she sat up so fast the room tilted sideways for a moment. "Easy," said a voice from across the room, calm and unhurried. "You're safe. Nothing happened. I promise." She turned toward the voice and found a man sitting in an armchair, still wearing yesterday's clothes, dark circles under his eyes like he hadn't slept at all. He held both hands slightly raised, the way a person does when they want to be seen as harmless, and something about the gesture, deliberate and careful, kept her from bolting straight for the door. "Where am I?" she said, her voice rough. "Who are you?" "My name is Daniel. We met last night, outside a bar. You were in trouble, and I helped you get somewhere safe. That's all that happened. I slept in this chair, you slept on the couch." He nodded toward a folded note sitting on the small table beside her, one she hadn't noticed yet. "I wrote that down for you too, in case you woke up before I did, and needed to read it instead of hearing it from a stranger." Claire picked up the note with unsteady fingers and read it, her eyes moving slowly over his handwriting. It said almost exactly what he had just told her, along with his name, his address, and a line at the bottom that read, "You can leave any time you want. There's water and aspirin on the counter. I only wanted you to be safe." She read it twice. Something in the careful, ordinary honesty of it loosened the knot in her chest, just slightly. "You said I was in trouble," she said slowly, memory returning to her in broken, unreliable pieces. "There was a car, 2 men." Daniel nodded. "You don't remember much of that, I'm guessing." "Bits," she admitted. "A car door. Someone talking to me. I thought I was imagining it." She pressed her palm to her forehead, wincing at the headache blooming behind her eyes. "Why would anyone be watching me outside a bar?" "I was hoping you could tell me that," Daniel said gently. "Do you know anyone who might have people looking for you? An ex, maybe, or someone from work? Anyone who might have a reason?" Claire went very still. Her eyes, still glassy from the night before, sharpened for the first time, some old fear surfacing behind them. "There's someone," she said quietly. "There was someone. I thought that was finished." Before Daniel could ask more, her phone buzzed on the coffee table where he had left it after failing to call her contact the night before. She flinched at the sound, like it had physically touched her. The screen lit up with a number she didn't recognize, no name attached, just 10 unfamiliar digits. She stared at it, unmoving, until it stopped ringing on its own. "You don't want to answer that," Daniel said. "It wasn't a question." "No," Claire said. "I really don't." The phone buzzed again almost immediately. The same unknown number. Claire's hand trembled as she reached for it, not to answer, but to turn it face down on the table, as if hiding the screen from her own eyes could make the call less real. Daniel watched her carefully, noting the way her breathing had changed, shallow and quick, the way her eyes kept flicking toward the front door like she expected it to open on its own. "Talk to me," he said, keeping his voice low and even. "Whatever this is, you don't have to explain everything right now, but if there's a reason 2 men were watching you last night, I need to understand at least a little of it, especially if they know where I live." Claire wrapped her arms around herself, the blanket pooling in her lap, and for a long moment she said nothing at all. When she finally spoke, her voice had lost all of its earlier fogginess, replaced by something flat and frightened. His name is Victor, she said. Victor Callahan. I used to work for him. Not directly, but close enough. I saw something I wasn't supposed to see, something involving money that didn't belong to the company, and I made the mistake of mentioning it to the wrong person. That was 4 months ago. I thought if I just stayed quiet and disappeared from his part of the city, it would be over. And last night, Daniel said slowly, was the first time you'd seen anyone since then? Claire nodded, her jaw tight. First time I actually saw them. There've been calls before, numbers I didn't know, silence on the other end, or someone breathing, and then hanging up. I told myself it was nothing. I told myself I was being paranoid. She let out a short, humorless laugh. I guess I wasn't. Daniel sat with that for a moment, turning it over, feeling the shape of the danger get larger and more solid in his mind. A drunk stranger stumbling out of a bar was one thing. A woman being hunted by people connected to stolen money was something else entirely. Something that came with real weight and real consequences, the kind that didn't simply evaporate with daylight. Okay, he said finally. First thing, don't answer any calls from numbers you don't know. Second, do you have somewhere safe you can go today? Somewhere they don't know about? Family? A friend outside the city? Anything? My sister Olivia, Claire said. She lives across town. I tried calling her last night, I think, but I don't remember if it went through. It didn't, Daniel said. I tried her number too, actually, hoping to find someone who could come get you. It rang out both times. Claire's eyes widened slightly at that small detail, the fact that this stranger had tried, quietly, to hand her off to someone safer, rather than keep her for himself, and something in her posture eased, just a fraction. She looked at him properly for the first time since waking, taking in his tired eyes, his rumpled shirt, the blanket he must have used instead of a real bed. You didn't have to do any of this, she said. You could have just left me outside. I know, Daniel said simply. I didn't want to. They sat in a brief, strange quiet after that, the kind that settles between two people who have just been through something neither of them fully understands yet. Claire drank the water he'd left for her, swallowed 2 aspirin, and slowly, piece by piece, told him more, about the company she used to work for, about the exact night she overheard something she shouldn't have, about a man named Victor Callahan who had built his reputation on being generous in public and merciless in private. She told him how she had quietly resigned, how she had moved apartments once already, how she had convinced herself, over 4 uneventful months, that the danger had passed. Daniel listened without interrupting, filing every detail away, and when she finished, he found himself glancing again toward the window, toward the thin gap in the curtain where the street below was visible. We should figure out what to do before you go anywhere, he said. If they know you were at that bar last night, there's a chance they followed us here too. I checked around 3 in the morning and didn't see the car, but that doesn't mean much. Claire's face paled. You think they know where you live? I think we should assume they might, Daniel said honestly, which means we plan carefully, instead of walking straight out the front door. As if the universe wanted to prove his caution correct, a knock sounded at the apartment door, 3 slow, deliberate raps, and both of them went completely silent, staring at the door like it had grown teeth. Daniel raised a finger to his lips, though Claire hadn't made a sound, and crossed the room slowly, careful to keep his footsteps quiet on the old wooden floor. He looked through the narrow peephole, his own breath sounding too loud in his ears, and felt a full second of relief loosen his shoulders before he even opened his mouth. It's my neighbor, he whispered back to Claire. Mrs. Patterson, from down the hall. She probably wants her mail key back. I borrowed it last week. He opened the door only partway, keeping his body between the gap and the room behind him, and exchanged a few quiet, ordinary words with an older woman in a cardigan, before closing it again and turning the lock. Claire let out a breath she had clearly been holding since the knock first sounded, her hand pressed flat against her chest. I think I'm losing my mind, she said, half laughing, half not, jumping at an old woman wanting her key back. You're not losing your mind, Daniel said. You're reacting exactly the way anyone would after last night. It's fine to be careful. Better to be careful and wrong than careless and right. Still, the knock had done something to the room, shrinking the safety of it, reminding them both that the apartment, however locked and quiet, was not some separate world sealed off from whatever was happening outside. Daniel moved to the window again, checked the street, and this time his stomach dropped just slightly. Parked 2 buildings down, on the opposite side of the road, sat a dark sedan he didn't recognize from the night before, different from the first car but positioned with the same unmistakable patience, angled just enough to see his building's front entrance. "Claire," he said quietly, "come look at this, but stay back from the glass." She joined him, peering carefully around the edge of the curtain, and her face went pale the moment she saw it. "That's not the same car as last night," she whispered. "That's a different one." "Which means either they've got more than 2 people looking for you," Daniel said, "or that's someone else entirely, who has no idea we exist, and this is nothing. I don't like either option enough to test it by walking straight out the front door." They spent the next half hour in careful, quiet planning, sitting close together at the small kitchen table, voices low even though there was no one else in the apartment to overhear them. Claire explained what she could remember about Victor Callahan's operation, the handful of men she recognized from the office, the fact that he preferred to have others do his watching and waiting for him, so his own hands stayed clean. Daniel listened, asked careful questions, and slowly, a rough plan began to take shape between them. His building had a second exit, a service door at the back that led out through a narrow alley used mostly by the building's trash collectors, a door most tenants didn't even know existed because it was tucked behind a stairwell most people never used. If they could reach that alley unseen, they could come out 3 streets away from wherever the sedan was watching, putting real distance between themselves and whoever sat inside it. "We'll need to look like we're not in a hurry," Daniel said, pulling a spare jacket from his closet, one with a hood, and handing it to Claire. "Pull this up. If anyone's watching for a woman in a green jacket, we don't want to be that." Claire took the jacket, her fingers tightening around the fabric, and looked up at him with something between gratitude and disbelief. "You're really doing all this for someone you met 12 hours ago." "I'm doing it because it's the right thing to do," Daniel said simply. "That's really all there is to it." They left through the back of the building 15 minutes later, moving quickly but not running, cutting through the narrow alley between overflowing bins and stacked crates. Emerging onto a side street Daniel knew well from years of delivering food across this part of the city on his bike. He kept close to Claire's side, scanning every parked car they passed, every doorway, every reflection in a shop window that might reveal someone following behind them. They reached a small coffee shop 4 blocks away. One Daniel chose, specifically because it had 2 exits and windows facing the street in both directions, and slipped inside, taking a table at the back where they could watch the door without being easily seen from outside. Claire wrapped both hands around a cup of tea she didn't really want, more for the warmth of holding something than any desire to drink it, and stared out at the street with the wary, watchful expression of someone who had stopped trusting the world to behave normally. "I need to call my sister," she said eventually. "She should know what's happening, and I need to figure out what I actually saw that night, the exact details, because if this is going to keep happening, I might need to prove it to someone who can actually do something about Victor." "The police," Daniel said. "Eventually, maybe," Claire said, though her voice wavered on the word. "Victor has friends in places that make people nervous about pressing too hard against him. I tried once before, quietly, through someone I trusted at my old office. It didn't go anywhere. It just made things worse." Daniel absorbed that in silence, understanding now why she had spent 4 months trying to disappear rather than fight back directly, and understanding too that whatever they did next would need to be smarter than simply walking into a police station and hoping for the best. He glanced toward the coffee shop's front window one more time, checking the street out of habit now rather than active fear, and froze. Standing on the opposite corner, half hidden by a newspaper stand, was the same man in the heavy jacket from the night before, the one who had crossed the street toward Claire outside the bar. He wasn't looking directly at the coffee shop. He was scanning the block methodically, the way a person searches when they know their target is close but haven't pinpointed the exact location yet. "Claire," Daniel said quietly, not moving his eyes from the window, "don't look up right away. But we need to leave through the back, and we need to do it now." Claire didn't argue. She set down her cup, slid out of the booth in one smooth motion, and followed Daniel toward the small hallway near the restrooms, where a door marked "Employees" only led out to a service lane behind the building. A young barista glanced up as they passed, opened her mouth to say something about the door being off limits, then seemed to read something urgent in their faces, and simply looked away instead. Outside, the lane smelled of old coffee grounds and rain-damp concrete. Daniel pulled Claire close to the wall, moving quickly but quietly, putting the length of 2 buildings between them and the corner where the man in the heavy jacket had been standing. Neither of them spoke until they reached the far end of the lane and turned onto a busier street full of ordinary people, going about an ordinary morning, strangers who had no idea how fast 2 hearts nearby were beating. "Do you think he saw us?" Claire asked, breathless, once they had put real distance behind them. "I don't know," Daniel admitted, "but we can't go back to my apartment. Not yet. And you definitely can't go back to yours." Claire pulled her hood tighter around her face, glancing over her shoulder despite herself, and Daniel understood, watching her, that whatever peaceful morning either of them had imagined when the sun came up was gone now, replaced by something far more urgent. They needed somewhere to think, somewhere neither of them was known to go, and they needed it before the man in the heavy jacket widened his search past that single corner. They found a public library 3 blocks further on, a large old building with tall windows and a reading room full of quiet strangers, and Daniel judged it as safe a place as any to stop and breathe. Nobody watching from a car outside a bar would think to look for them among the shelves of a library on a weekday morning. Claire sank into a chair at an empty table near the back, pulled her hood down at last now that they were indoors, and pressed both hands against her face for a long moment before looking up. "I need to call Olivia," she said. "For real this time." She borrowed Daniel's phone since her own battery had dropped dangerously low overnight, and dialed a number from memory, her fingers trembling slightly on the screen. It rang twice before a voice answered, sharp with worry even before Claire had said a word. "Claire? Whose number is this? I've been calling you since last night. Where have you been?" "I'm okay," Claire said quickly, though her voice cracked on the second word. "I'm okay, Olivia, I promise. But I need your help. Victor's people found me." There was a beat of silence on the other end, the kind that carried real weight, and when Olivia spoke again her voice had dropped low and serious. "I told you this wasn't over. I told you moving apartments wasn't going to be enough. Where are you right now?" Claire explained, as quickly and clearly as her exhausted mind would allow, everything that had happened since the night before, the men outside the bar, the stranger who had gotten her to safety, the sedan parked near his building, the man in the heavy jacket standing on the corner near the coffee shop. Daniel sat across from her, watching her face shift through fear and relief and something like shame as she spoke, and when she finally paused for breath, he heard a tinny, urgent voice on the other end of the line say something he couldn't quite make out. "She wants to meet us," Claire said, lowering the phone slightly. "Somewhere public, somewhere neutral. She says she has something to tell me too. Something she's been trying to say for weeks and didn't know how." They agreed on a small park near the edge of the city, a place with wide-open sightlines and multiple exits, chosen carefully by Daniel, with the same instinct that had gotten them safely out of the coffee shop. It took them nearly 40 minutes to get there, taking a longer, indirect route on foot, doubling back once through a shopping arcade just to be certain no one had picked up their trail again. By the time they reached the park, Claire's nerves were worn thin as paper, and even Daniel, usually steady, found himself scanning every bench and every jogger, with more suspicion than the situation probably called for. Olivia was waiting on a bench near the fountain, a woman a few years older than Claire with the same dark hair and the same sharp, worried eyes, and the moment she saw her sister she stood and pulled her into a tight embrace that lasted a long time. Daniel hung back slightly, giving them the space, until Olivia finally released her sister and turned to look at him properly. "You're the one who helped her," she said. It wasn't quite a question. "Daniel," he said, offering a hand. "I found her outside a bar last night. There were men watching her. I didn't think it was safe to leave her alone." Olivia studied him for a long moment, the way an older sister studies anyone who has suddenly appeared in her younger sibling's life, and then, apparently satisfied by whatever she saw, nodded once. "Thank you," she said simply. "I mean that." They sat together on the bench, close enough to speak quietly, and Olivia explained what she had been trying to say for weeks, the thing she hadn't found the courage to tell Claire directly until now. She had also worked briefly for a company connected to Victor Callahan, years earlier, before Claire had even started there, and she had left under circumstances she had never fully explained to her sister. She had seen, back then, exactly how far Victor's reach extended when someone crossed him, and she had spent years quietly terrified that her own history with the man might one day circle back and touch Claire's life too. "I should have told you everything the moment you started working there," Olivia said, her voice thick with guilt. "I thought if I stayed quiet, if none of it ever came up, it would just stay buried. I was wrong. I'm sorry." "It's not your fault," Claire said, though her voice wavered on the words. "None of this is your fault." Olivia reached into her bag and pulled out a slim folder, worn at the edges, clearly kept somewhere safe for a long time. Inside were photocopies of old documents, financial records with numbers circled in faded ink, names highlighted, dates marked with small notes in the margin. "I kept copies," she said quietly. "Back when I worked there, I always thought I might need them someday, as protection, in case anyone ever came after me, the way it sounds like they're coming after you now." Daniel leaned forward slightly, looking at the documents without touching them, understanding immediately what he was looking at. Proof. Not rumor, not fear, not a half-remembered night overheard through a closed door, but actual evidence of exactly the kind of thing Claire had stumbled onto months earlier. Evidence that, in the right hands, could turn Victor Callahan from a man people were too frightened to challenge, into a man people had every reason to challenge. "This is real," Claire whispered, flipping through the pages, her eyes widening as the numbers and names began to form a clear, damning picture. "This is everything I only half saw. This proves it. It also means the danger just went up," Olivia said grimly. "If Victor knows I kept this, if he's even suspected it all these years, then both of us are targets now, not just you." She glanced toward the park entrance, toward the street beyond it, her earlier calm cracking slightly at the edges. "We need somewhere safer than a public bench to figure out what happens next." As if the day had been waiting for exactly that line to be spoken, a dark sedan rolled slowly past the park's outer road, the same make and color Daniel had spotted from his apartment window that morning, moving at a pace too careful to be anyone simply passing through. Daniel's whole body went still. "Don't look at the car," he said quietly, urgently, to both sisters. "Just stand up, slowly, and start walking toward the far exit, like nothing's wrong." Olivia slid the folder back into her bag, in one smooth, practiced motion, and the three of them rose from the bench together, falling into an easy, unhurried stride that gave nothing away to anyone watching from the road. Daniel kept his eyes forward, using the corner of his vision to track the sedan's slow progress along the park's edge, and felt a cold, familiar tightness settle back into his chest. The car didn't stop. It rolled past the bench where they had been sitting, past the fountain, and continued on toward the far corner of the park. And for a moment, Daniel allowed himself to hope it truly was nothing, some unrelated driver taking an unrelated route. Then, near the corner, brake lights flared red, and the sedan pulled into a narrow space along the curb, facing back toward the park entrance they were now walking directly toward. "Change of plan," Daniel said quietly. "There's a side gate near the playground, on the north end. We go that way instead." They altered their course without breaking stride, angling across the open grass rather than following the paved path, moving with the unhurried pace of people simply enjoying a walk, rather than people fleeing anything at all. Claire's hand found her sister's, gripping tight, and Olivia squeezed back without looking down, both of them keeping their faces forward, calm, ordinary, while every nerve in their bodies screamed to run. They reached the north gate and slipped through onto a residential street lined with parked cars and quiet houses, and only once they had turned two corners and put real distance behind them did Daniel finally let his shoulders drop half an inch. "I think we're clear," he said, though even as he said it he kept glancing back over his shoulder every few seconds, unable to fully believe it. "That's twice today," Claire said, her voice shaking now that the immediate danger had passed, and the fear was finally allowed to catch up with her. "Twice in one morning. How do they keep finding us?" "They might not be finding us specifically," Olivia said, though she didn't sound convinced by her own words. "Victor has people watching a lot of places connected to me, and to you, out of habit, in case either of us ever surfaces again. It could be bad luck as much as anything targeted. Or it could be exactly what it looks like," Daniel said grimly. "Someone tracking your phone or watching your usual places, or having been tipped off that you were together this morning. We need to assume the worst and plan around that instead of hoping for the best." They ducked into a small diner 2 streets over, chosen mostly because it was crowded enough to blend into and old-fashioned enough to still take cash, no digital trail, No card left behind for anyone to trace. They took a booth near the back, ordered coffee none of them particularly wanted, and spread Olivia's folder carefully across the table between them, keeping their voices low beneath the clatter of plates and the murmur of other conversations. "If we're going to do something with this," Claire said, tapping the edge of the folder, "we need to do it fast, before they corner one of us somewhere we can't get away from. And we need someone who can actually do something with it, not just report it and let Victor's lawyers bury it in paperwork for 2 years." "There's a journalist," Olivia said slowly, thinking it through as she spoke. "Someone I used to know, back when I first left the company. She covers financial corruption stories, the kind that actually stick because she builds her cases carefully before she ever publishes anything. If we bring this to her, along with what you saw and heard, she might be able to get it moving fast enough that going after us stops being useful to Victor. Because once it's out," Daniel said, following the logic, "hurting either of you doesn't make the problem disappear anymore. It just makes him look guiltier." "Exactly," Olivia said. "Right now, we're the only 2 people who could speak against him directly, plus whatever proof I kept hidden. If that stops being true, if it becomes public, and the 2 of us stop being the only witnesses, we stop being worth chasing." Claire looked down at the folder, at the careful, damning numbers her sister had protected for years without ever telling her, and something in her expression shifted, fear giving way, slowly, to something steadier. "Okay," she said, "let's call her. Let's do this today, before I lose my nerve." Olivia reached for her phone, and Daniel watched the 2 sisters lean together over the small table, heads close, voices low, planning something that had the real chance of finally ending the fear that had been living quietly under Claire's skin for 4 long months. He felt, watching them, a strange mixture of relief and renewed tension, aware that bringing this into the light was the right choice, and also the most dangerous one they had made yet, because cornered men rarely became safer once they realized they were about to lose everything. Outside the diner window, unnoticed by any of them in the warmth of their planning, a man in a heavy jacket walked slowly past on the opposite side of the street, phone pressed to his ear, his eyes moving methodically across every storefront he passed. Olivia dialed the journalist's number and put the call on speaker, keeping the volume low. A woman named Grace Whitfield answered on the 3rd ring, her voice brisk and businesslike in the way of someone used to being interrupted by important calls. Olivia explained quickly who she was, reminding Grace of a conversation they'd had years earlier that had never gone anywhere, and then, carefully, laid out what they now had: financial records, a recent witness, a pattern of intimidation that had started again within the last day. There was a pause on the line, the sound of papers shifting, and when Grace spoke again, her voice had sharpened with real interest. "Send me what you can over a secure channel, not email, something I can walk you through instead. And then we need to meet in person, somewhere none of us are known to go. I've dealt with people like Victor Callahan before. They don't stay careless forever, so we move quickly, and we move quietly." They arranged to meet late that afternoon, at a small office Grace kept above a bookshop on the far side of the city, a location she insisted was safe, unconnected to her usual newsroom, and unknown to anyone outside a small circle she trusted completely. The call ended, and for the first time since the night before, Claire allowed herself something close to hope, a loosening around her eyes that hadn't been there since she'd woken up on Daniel's couch that morning. "We have a few hours before we need to be there," Olivia said, checking the time. "We should stay moving, not stay in one place too long." They finished their coffee, paid in cash as planned, and stepped back out onto the street, with a plan forming solidly beneath them, for the first time since the danger had begun. Daniel scanned the sidewalk out of habit, checking parked cars, checking doorways, and his eyes caught, for just a fraction of a second, on a figure a block down wearing a jacket too heavy for the mild afternoon, phone pressed to his ear, moving with unhurried, deliberate steps in their general direction. He didn't say anything immediately, not wanting to spook Claire and Olivia before he was certain, but he steered their path subtly toward a side street, instead of continuing straight, watching from the corner of his eye to see whether the figure adjusted course to follow. It did. "We've got company," Daniel said quietly, keeping his voice level even as his pulse climbed. "Don't run, just follow me." They moved quickly through a covered market 2 blocks over, weaving between stalls selling fruit and flowers and secondhand books, using the crowd as cover, the way Daniel had learned to do years ago navigating busy streets on his delivery bike, always aware of exits, always aware of the fastest way through a crowd rather than around it. Claire kept close behind him, Olivia at her side, both sisters trusting a stranger's instincts, because those instincts had already proven right once today. They emerged from the far end of the market onto a street lined with parked delivery vans, and Daniel spotted, with a small surge of relief, a public bus idling at a stop just ahead, doors still open, a handful of passengers boarding. "There," he said, and they moved quickly, not quite running, and climbed aboard just as the doors began to hiss shut behind them. Through the bus window, as it pulled away from the curb, Daniel watched the man in the heavy jacket reach the corner they had just left, stop, and look around with the frustrated stillness of someone who had lost a trail he'd been certain of only moments before. The bus turned onto a wider avenue, and the man disappeared from view, and only then did Daniel allow himself to sit back fully in his seat, his heart still hammering against his ribs. "That was too close," Claire whispered, gripping the folder tightly against her chest, like it might be torn from her hands at any moment. "How did he find us again?" "I don't know," Daniel admitted, "but we need to be more careful from here on. No phones out in the open, no lingering anywhere longer than we have to. We get to Grace's office, we hand over what we have, and we let someone with real resources take it from there." Olivia nodded, her face pale but steady, and Claire, beside her, stared down at the folder in her lap, at the proof that had waited years to be used, now finally on its way toward the daylight that might, at last, put an end to the fear that had followed her out of that bar the night before. The bookshop sat on a quiet corner, its window display faded by years of sunlight, an ordinary-looking place that gave no hint of the narrow staircase hidden behind a curtain near the back, leading up to a small office where Grace Whitfield was already waiting for them. She was younger than Daniel had expected, sharp-eyed, with the restless energy of someone who had spent years chasing stories other people wanted buried. She waved them in, locked the door behind them, and got straight to business without wasting time on pleasantries. "Let me see what you have," she said, and Olivia laid the folder open across a cluttered desk. Grace went through it page by page, her expression sharpening with every entry, occasionally pausing to ask a quiet, precise question, cross-referencing dates against names she already seemed to recognize. "This is more than I expected," she said finally, sitting back. "I've had pieces of this story for over a year, rumors mostly, nothing I could print without real proof. This changes things." Claire, sitting on the edge of a worn couch against the wall, leaned forward. "What happens now?" "Now I verify everything independently," Grace said. "That takes time usually. But given what you've told me about people watching you as recently as this afternoon, I don't think we have the luxury of a normal timeline. I have a contact inside the Financial Oversight Office who owes me a favor. If I can get preliminary confirmation from her within the next day, I can push this story out fast, faster than Victor's people will expect." "And once it's out," Daniel said, "there's no reason left to come after Claire or Olivia." "There's still a small window of danger," Grace admitted honestly. "Cornered men sometimes do the most reckless things right before they lose control of a situation, not after. Until this is actually published, I'd treat every hour as if the danger is at its highest, not its lowest." The words settled uncomfortably over the room, and Claire felt the small, fragile hope she had been carrying since the diner tighten back into something closer to dread. Olivia reached over and squeezed her sister's hand, and Daniel, watching them both, felt the weight of responsibility settle more firmly onto his own shoulders, a feeling he hadn't expected when he'd simply meant to walk a stranger safely home the night before. Grace made a series of calls from a separate room, her voice low and businesslike through the thin wall, while the three of them waited in tense silence, drinking bitter coffee from mismatched mugs, watching the light outside the window slowly shift toward evening. When she finally returned, her expression had changed, sharper, more urgent. "My contact confirmed enough to move forward," she said. "I can have a preliminary story ready by tomorrow morning, enough to put real pressure on Victor's operation immediately, with the full investigation following over the next few weeks. But I need one more thing from you, Claire. A recorded statement, on record, describing exactly what you saw and heard that night at the office. Without it, this is still just numbers on a page. With it, it's a story people can't ignore. Claire's hands tightened in her lap. Saying it out loud, on the record, with her name attached, meant there was no longer any pretending the danger might simply pass her by if she stayed quiet long enough. It meant choosing, finally and completely, to stand against the very thing she had spent 4 months running from. She looked at Olivia, who nodded once, steady and sure. She looked at Daniel, who said nothing at all, understanding this wasn't a decision anyone else could make for her. "Okay," Claire said quietly. "Let's do it." The recording took nearly an hour, Grace guiding her gently through each detail, pausing whenever Claire's voice shook too badly to continue, letting her collect herself before starting again. By the time it was finished, the light outside had faded fully into evening, and Claire looked exhausted in a way that had nothing to do with the alcohol from the night before, and everything to do with finally releasing something she had been carrying, silently and heavily, for months. "That's everything I need for now," Grace said, saving the file carefully, backing it up in 2 separate places before closing her laptop. "Go somewhere safe tonight, somewhere none of you have been before, somewhere Victor's people have no reason to check. Once the story runs tomorrow, this gets a lot harder for him to manage quietly." Daniel thought quickly, running through the short list of places that fit that description, and landed on an idea. "I have a friend outside the city," he said. "A small guest house he rents out. Nothing official. No name on a lease anyone could trace back to either of you. It's a 2-hour drive, but it's quiet, and nobody watching either of your usual places would think to look there." Claire and Olivia exchanged a glance, and Olivia nodded first. "It's worth it," she said. "One more night of being careful, and then hopefully, we won't have to be anymore." They left the bookshop separately, at staggered intervals, taking different routes to a rented car Daniel arranged through an app on his phone, rather than a company that might keep easily traceable records. By the time they were finally on the road, the city lights thinning out behind them into darker countryside, Claire allowed herself, for the first time all day, to lean her head back against the seat and close her eyes, not quite sleeping, but resting in a way she hadn't been able to since waking on a stranger's couch that morning. Daniel drove carefully, checking his mirrors out of habit every few minutes, long after the last city lights had disappeared behind them, and it was nearly 40 minutes into the drive, deep into a stretch of dark, empty road lined with trees, when he first noticed the headlights behind them, matching their speed exactly, staying at precisely the same distance, no matter how Daniel adjusted his own pace. "Olivia," he said quietly, glancing at the rearview mirror, "how good are you at reading a road behind us without turning around?" Olivia twisted slightly in her seat, glancing back through the rear window with practiced casualness. "There's a car," she confirmed, her voice tightening. "It's been there since the last turn. Hasn't passed. Hasn't fallen back." Claire's eyes snapped open. "You're joking." "I wish I was," Daniel said, his knuckles tightening slightly on the wheel. "Hold on. I'm going to take the next turn and see what it does." He signaled, took the exit toward a smaller side road without slowing more than necessary, and watched the mirror carefully. For 3 agonizing seconds, the headlights behind them continued straight along the main road, and Daniel almost let himself relax. Then, at the last possible moment, the trailing car swerved and took the same exit, and any remaining doubt about whether they were being followed evaporated completely. "They found us," Claire whispered, her voice thin with fear. "How? We were so careful." "I don't know," Daniel said grimly, pressing the accelerator down slightly, his mind racing through the dark, unfamiliar road ahead. "But we're not leading them straight to the guest house. Everyone hold on." The road narrowed as it wound between dark stretches of farmland. No streetlights out here, only the twin beams of their own headlights, and the matching pair behind them. Always the same distance, never closing in, as if whoever was driving wanted them to know they were being followed, rather than trying to hide it. Daniel's mind worked quickly, weighing options. A straight chase on an unfamiliar road at night was a losing game, especially not knowing what lay ahead, or how many turns the road actually offered before it dead-ended somewhere with no way out. "There's a town about 10 minutes ahead," Olivia said, pulling up a map on her phone, her voice steadier than Daniel expected under the circumstances. "If we can get somewhere with people around, businesses still open, that changes things. They won't want witnesses." 10 minutes is a long time on a road like this," Daniel said, but he kept his foot steady on the accelerator, unwilling to push recklessly fast on a road he didn't know well enough to trust its speed. Behind them, the trailing headlights suddenly surged closer, cutting the distance in half within seconds, and Claire gasped, gripping the door handle. "They're speeding up," she said. Daniel's jaw tightened. He took the next curve a little faster than was comfortable, feeling the car's weight shift, and used the brief moment where the trees blocked the following car's view to flick off his headlights for 2 full seconds, letting the moonlight alone guide him around the bend, before switching them back on. It was a small trick, barely a delay, but it was enough to buy a few seconds of confusion, the following car's headlights swinging wide for a moment, as if unsure exactly where the road had gone. "Hold on," he said again, and took the next fork in the road hard, cutting left onto a narrower lane that Olivia's map showed leading toward the outskirts of the town she had mentioned. The move gained them perhaps 10 extra seconds, no more, but on a night like this, every second mattered. Lights appeared ahead, first scattered, then closer together, a gas station glowing at the edge of the coming town, still open, a single attendant visible through the lit windows, another car parked at the pumps. Daniel pulled in without slowing as much as caution would normally demand, tires briefly skidding on the gravel shoulder before catching pavement again, and brought the car to a stop directly beneath the brightest light the station offered, right beside the parked customer's vehicle, and close to the station's glass front doors. Behind them, the trailing car slowed as it approached the turn into the station, hesitated for a long moment under the bright lights and the presence of witnesses, and then continued straight past without stopping, its tail lights shrinking into the dark ahead until they disappeared entirely around a bend in the road. For several seconds, nobody in Daniel's car spoke at all. Claire was breathing hard, both hands still gripping the door handle so tightly her knuckles had gone pale. Olivia stared out the rear window long after the taillights had vanished, as if expecting them to reappear at any moment. "They're gone," Daniel said finally, though his own voice came out rougher than he intended, for now at least. "That was them, wasn't it?" Claire said. "Not just some random car on the road. That was actually them." "I think so," Daniel admitted, which means Grace was right. Cornered people get reckless right before they lose control, not after. We need to assume they know roughly where we're headed, or at least which direction, and adjust the plan. They sat in the gas station lot a while longer, letting their pulses settle, before Daniel went inside briefly to buy water, and to ask, as casually as he could manage, whether the attendant had noticed the car that had passed through without stopping. The young man behind the counter shrugged, uninterested, more focused on a phone propped against the register than on the road outside, and Daniel returned to the car with little more information than he'd started with, though the errand had at least given all three of them a few minutes to breathe inside brightly lit, ordinary walls. Back on the road, Daniel took a different route than originally planned, adding 20 extra minutes by cutting through a series of smaller towns, rather than the direct route the following car might have anticipated. Olivia called Grace along the way, updating her quickly on what had happened, and Grace's voice came back tense but steady through the speaker, promising that the story's publication had been moved up, set now to go live within hours rather than waiting for the following morning. "The sooner this is public," Grace said, "the sooner chasing either of you stops being worth the risk to him. Get somewhere safe, and stay there. I'll call the moment it's live." They reached the guest house well past midnight, a small, quiet building tucked behind a stand of trees, unmarked by any sign, exactly as unremarkable as Daniel had promised. His friend, roused from sleep by a late call, met them at the door without asking many questions, handed over a set of keys, and left them to settle in, sensing correctly that this was not a night for conversation. Inside, with the doors locked and curtains drawn, Claire finally allowed the exhaustion of the entire day to catch up with her all at once, sinking onto the edge of a narrow bed, her hands finally still in her lap. Olivia sat beside her, an arm around her shoulders, and Daniel stood near the window, watching the dark road outside for a long while, before finally letting the curtain fall shut. "Do you think it's really going to be over?" Claire asked quietly, "once the story comes out?" Daniel considered the question carefully before answering, unwilling to offer false comfort now, not after everything they had already survived together. "I think it's going to get loud before it gets quiet," he said honestly, "but I think it will end. Just maybe not gently." None of them slept easily that night, each taking turns dozing in short, uneasy stretches, waking at small sounds the way Daniel had the night before, listening for engines on the road outside, for footsteps that never came. Somewhere around 4 in the morning, Daniel's phone buzzed on the nightstand, and he sat up instantly, heart already racing before he'd even looked at the screen. It was Grace. The story was live. Daniel woke Claire and Olivia, and the three of them huddled together over his phone's small screen in the dark, reading the headline twice before the words fully registered. The article laid out, calmly and carefully, everything Olivia's documents had shown, everything Claire had witnessed, presented not as accusation but as verified fact, backed by financial records and a named oversight contact who confirmed an active review had already begun. It was measured, precise, and utterly damning. "It's real," Claire said, her voice barely above a whisper, as if speaking too loudly might somehow undo it. "It's actually out there." Olivia scrolled further, watching the article's early numbers climb, already being shared, already drawing comments from people who had clearly been waiting a long time for someone to say this out loud. "This isn't something he can quietly bury," she said. "Not anymore." Daniel felt something in his own chest ease slightly, though not completely. Not yet. A published story didn't undo the fact that a man in a heavy jacket had chased them along a dark road only hours earlier, or that whoever had been giving him orders might not simply lie down the moment his secrets became public. Desperate men, Grace had warned, didn't always become safer once cornered. His phone buzzed again almost immediately, an unknown number this time, and all three of them stared at the screen for a long moment, before Daniel finally answered, keeping the call on speaker so Claire and Olivia could hear. "You should have stayed out of this," said a voice on the other end, low and controlled, carrying none of the panic Daniel might have expected from a man whose secrets had just been exposed to the entire city. "Both of you. All three of you. Now, I suppose." Claire's hand found Olivia's in the dark. "Victor," she breathed. "The story doesn't change anything tonight," the voice continued, ignoring her. "It just means I have less patience left than I did yesterday. I know roughly where you are. It won't take much longer to know exactly." The call ended abruptly, the line going dead before Daniel could respond, and the small guest room fell into a silence so complete he could hear his own pulse hammering in his ears. Outside, far off but unmistakable, the low growl of an approaching engine broke the quiet of the countryside night. Daniel was moving before the sound had fully registered in his own mind, crossing to the window and easing the curtain back just enough to see a pair of headlights turning off the main road, sweeping slowly along the narrow track that led toward the guest house. There was no mistaking it this time, no ambiguity to cling to, no ordinary explanation waiting to comfort them. Someone was coming, and they knew exactly where to look. "We need to move now," Daniel said, already pulling on his shoes, his voice low and urgent. "Out the back, toward the trees. There's a path my friend mentioned, leads down to a stream, and eventually toward the next town over. It's not much, but it's better than staying here and hoping the door holds." Claire grabbed the folder of documents without thinking, clutching it against her chest as if it were something living that needed protecting, while Olivia snatched both their phones off the nightstand. They moved quickly and quietly through the small house, out through a back door that stuck slightly in its frame, into the cool, damp air of the countryside night, the headlights behind them growing steadily brighter through the trees as the car drew closer to the house. They reached the tree line just as the sound of car doors slamming shut carried faintly across the yard behind them, and Daniel pulled both women down into a crouch behind a wide, old trunk, pressing a finger to his lips. Through gaps in the branches, they watched two figures approach the guest house's front door. One of them the man in the heavy jacket, unmistakable even in the dim porch light, the other broader, moving with the unhurried confidence of someone used to being obeyed. "That's him," Claire whispered, so quietly it was barely sound at all. "That's Victor." The two men tried the front door, found it locked, and moved with practiced efficiency toward the back of the house instead, clearly expecting to find it unoccupied inside, clearly not expecting the three people they were hunting to already be crouched 30 feet away in the dark, watching. Daniel's heart pounded so hard he was certain it could be heard across the yard, and he kept one hand resting lightly on Claire's shoulder, willing her to stay still, to stay silent, to trust that moving now, into the deeper dark of the trees, was safer than staying frozen where they were. He gestured with his head toward the path his friend had described, and the three of them began moving, slow and careful at first, then faster once the trees thickened enough to muffle the sound of their footsteps on the soft ground. Behind them, a shout rang out from the direction of the house, sharp and angry, the sound of a door being forced, and Daniel knew without needing to look back that their absence had just been discovered. "Run," he said, no longer bothering to whisper. Now, they ran through the dark, branches catching at their clothes, the ground uneven and treacherous beneath their feet, guided only by the faint moonlight filtering down through the canopy above. Behind them, flashlight beams began sweeping through the trees, cutting bright, searching lines through the dark, and the sound of two sets of footsteps crashing through underbrush told Daniel their pursuers had chosen the same path down toward the stream, closing the distance far faster than he had hoped they would. Claire stumbled on a root, nearly going down, and Olivia caught her arm, hauling her back upright without breaking stride. Daniel's mind raced, searching for any advantage the darkness might offer, any way to slow the men behind them without putting either sister in more danger than they already faced. Ahead, through the trees, he caught the glint of water, the stream Olivia had mentioned catching moonlight along its surface, and beyond it, faintly, the scattered lights of the next town. "The stream," he said, breathless. "If we cross it, it slows them down, buys us distance." They reached the bank moments later, the water shallow but fast-moving, cold enough to sting through their shoes the instant they stepped in. Claire gasped at the cold, nearly losing her footing on the slick stones beneath the surface, and Daniel gripped her arm firmly, guiding her across step by careful step, while Olivia followed close behind, the folder of documents held high above the water to keep it dry. Behind them, the flashlight beams reached the stream's edge, just as the three of them scrambled up the far bank, soaked and shivering, and Daniel heard one of the men curse loudly at the water, clearly less willing to follow directly through the cold current than to search for another way around. "Keep moving," Daniel urged, pulling Claire forward, toward the lights. They pushed on through the last stretch of trees, emerging finally onto the edge of a quiet residential street on the outskirts of the next town, porch lights glowing warmly ahead, an ordinary suburban scene that felt, after the last 20 minutes, almost unbelievably safe. Daniel didn't slow down until they had put a full block between themselves and the tree line. Gasping for breath, Claire and Olivia both doubled over beside him, soaked and exhausted but, for the moment, alive and unharmed. "We need the police," Olivia said between breaths, already pulling out her phone. "Now. Real ones. Right now. Not after we've caught our breath." She dialed with trembling fingers, explaining quickly and clearly to the dispatcher who answered, giving their location, describing the two men who had chased them from the guest house, mentioning Victor Callahan's name directly, now that the story was already public, and there was nothing left to protect by staying silent. The dispatcher's voice sharpened audibly partway through the call, and Olivia glanced at Claire with something like disbelief. "They already have an alert out for him," she said, lowering the phone slightly. "The story going public this morning triggered an investigation fast enough that there's already a warrant. They're sending a unit now." They waited on that quiet suburban corner, huddled together for warmth, watching both directions of the street for any sign of pursuit, until the comforting flash of red and blue lights finally turned onto the block, two patrol cars pulling up slowly, officers stepping out with careful, practiced caution. Daniel raised both hands automatically, an old habit from a lifetime of understanding how quickly misunderstandings could turn dangerous, and explained as clearly as his exhausted mind allowed exactly what had happened and where the men chasing them had last been seen. It took another hour, tense and cold, huddled in the back of a patrol car with a blanket around her shoulders, before Claire finally learned that both men had been located near the guest house, along with a third vehicle parked further down the road, and taken into custody without further incident. Victor Callahan himself, it turned out, had been arrested separately, at his own home across the city, mere hours after Grace's story had gone live, his lawyers already scrambling to respond to charges that had been building quietly for years, before finally breaking into the open all at once. An officer crouched beside them for a few minutes, asking gentle, careful questions, taking down details about the phone call Daniel had received, about the two men in the trees, about everything they could remember from the moment the headlights first appeared on the narrow track toward the guest house. Claire answered as clearly as her exhausted mind allowed, her hands still faintly trembling around the warm cup someone had pressed into them, and when the officer finally closed her notebook, she offered a small, reassuring nod. "You did the right thing, calling this in immediately," the officer said, "and getting yourselves clear before we arrived. That's not always the instinct people have in the moment, but it's the one that keeps people safe." Word came through on the radio a short while later, relayed to them by a second officer who had been coordinating with the units near the guest house, confirming that both men had been taken into custody without incident, along with the vehicle that had followed them along the dark country road hours earlier. Claire felt something in her chest finally unclench at the news, a tightness she realized, only now that it was gone, she had been carrying since the moment she first saw the car parked outside the bar 2 nights before. Olivia, sitting close beside her, exhaled slowly and let her head rest briefly against her sister's shoulder. "It's over," she said quietly, as if testing whether the words were really true. "It's actually over." "Almost," Daniel said gently. "There's still the case itself, still questions, still Victor's lawyers, who'll try every angle they can find. But the part where people were chasing you through the dark, yes, that part is over. They were driven, eventually, to a small local hospital, more as a precaution than out of any real necessity, where a doctor checked them over for injuries from the run through the trees and the cold crossing of the stream, pronouncing all 3 of them shaken but otherwise unharmed. Claire sat on the edge of the examination table, a fresh blanket around her shoulders, and found herself, unexpectedly, laughing softly at nothing in particular, the strange release of tension finally finding somewhere to go. "What's funny?" Olivia asked, watching her sister with a small, curious smile of her own. "Nothing," Claire said, still laughing quietly. "Everything. I don't know. I just can't believe 2 days ago my biggest problem was deciding whether to go out for one drink after a long week." She wiped at her eyes, the laughter tangled up now with something closer to tears, relief and exhaustion blurring together into one overwhelming wave. "And now look at all this." Daniel, standing near the door, allowed himself a tired smile of his own, watching the 2 sisters lean into each other, watching the fear that had gripped both of them for so long finally begin, slowly, to loosen its hold. By the time the sun rose fully over the trees, painting the sky in soft orange light, Claire sat wrapped in a blanket on the back steps of the local police station, a cup of hot tea warming her hands, Olivia beside her, and Daniel a few feet away, finally allowing himself to sit down properly for the first time in what felt like days. None of them spoke for a long while, simply sitting together in the quiet, tired relief of having survived something that, only 36 hours earlier, none of them could have imagined coming. "I still don't know how to thank you," Claire said eventually, turning to look at Daniel properly, really looking at him, the exhausted stranger who had stopped on a dark street 2 nights ago because something hadn't looked right. "You didn't have to do any of this, any single part of it." "I know," Daniel said, echoing his own words from that first morning, though this time there was a small, tired smile behind them. "I'm glad I did, though. All of it." Olivia, watching the 2 of them, said nothing, but the small, knowing look she exchanged with her sister said enough on its own. In the weeks that followed, the story around Victor Callahan grew larger with each passing day, investigators uncovering more with every document Olivia's careful years of quiet protection had helped bring to light, the full scale of what he had built through fear and stolen money, slowly unraveling in public view. Claire testified formally once the case moved forward, her voice steadier each time she told the story, the fear that had once tightened her chest replaced gradually by something closer to relief, and eventually, something close to pride. She and Daniel stayed in touch long after that first strange, frightening night faded into something they could finally look back on, rather than live inside. What began as a stranger's simple decision to make sure a vulnerable woman got home safely, slowly became something neither of them had expected. A friendship built through fire, tested by danger neither could have predicted, and strengthened by every difficult hour they had survived side by side. Olivia joked, more than once, that she owed her sister's life to a man who had simply refused to walk past trouble when he saw it, and every time she said it, Claire found herself agreeing completely. Months later, sitting together on a quiet evening with nothing more dangerous ahead of them than deciding what to order for dinner, Claire looked over at Daniel and thought, not for the first time, about how differently that night could have gone, if he had simply kept walking past the bar, past a stranger stumbling in the dark, telling himself, as so many people might have, that it wasn't his business to get involved. She was endlessly grateful that he hadn't. "You really do have an honest face," she said, echoing the first thing she had ever told him, back when the alcohol had still blurred every edge of that terrifying night. "My sister was right about that." Daniel laughed, the sound easy and unguarded in a way it hadn't been in weeks. "Good thing I decided to trust it too," he said, "the moment I saw you needed someone to." And there, in the quiet, ordinary safety of an evening, that finally belonged to nothing but themselves, the story that had begun in fear and danger settled, at last, into something steady, something real, something neither of them had expected but both, in the end, were glad to have found.